From Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and the Captain William Miller Building and the Gail Lemron Auditorium, welcome to the President Speaker Series. I'm Mark Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. Aviation, and specifically general aviation, is changing. The rules that govern it and the policies that work with it, and how the government interacts with the private sector, all in focus tonight with our special guest. He is the head of the Fuller Company and the former president of the AOPA. Broadcasting live tonight as well on 1150 WNDB and FM 93.5. Thank you for being with us as we welcome to the President Speaker Series tonight, Craig Fuller.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So good of you to come up.
Thank you, Mark.
See us. Thank you.
It's terrific to be here. I think a great deal of Embry-Riddle University and the work they do here, and so it's a pleasure to get back on campus.
I want to begin because before we get to aviation, we have a lot to talk about, and we are so fortunate to have Craig Fuller with us tonight because we get the scoop on a story, because tomorrow Craig flies back to Washington and he will testify before a congressional committee. But before we get to that, a lot of our listeners study politics, and you were in the White House 1981, I think, worked for the Vice President, and then who later became President George H.W. Bush. Tell us about that experience. What got you into the White House?
Well, you know, I had the good fortune when I was at UCLA as a political science major to participate in an internship program in Sacramento, California when Ronald Reagan was governor. It's one of those things that you do in life that you're not sure what impact it will have, and of course it's ended up shaping my life ever since. I met then Governor Reagan and the people around him. I worked in a firm that managed his affairs after he left the governor's office. I flew, by the way, my own Cessna Cutlass around the western states in particular. And when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980 at the age of 30, just 7 years after graduating from UCLA with a political science major, in 1981, as you said, I ended up in the West Wing of the White House running an office called the Office of Cabinet Affairs, which brought all of the domestic policy issues from the cabinet agencies and departments into the White House. It was a spectacular opportunity. It was a huge honor to serve. I got to know Vice President Bush, and I was maybe thinking after one term, 4 years, I would leave when he asked me to be his chief of staff, which I did, and spent 4 years as his chief of staff, going to over 60 countries in every state in the nation multiple times on official business, but obviously also on a presidential campaign. 8 years of that, and I told him during the campaign year that I was 100% on board, but I thought he'd get elected. But if he got elected, I thought it was time for me to leave government. And I actually went to Washington, D.C. in 1981 with the great idea that I would spend 3, maybe 4 years there. That was 30-some years ago, so I'm still there.
What was he like as a vice president?
Well, it's always interesting. I get asked that, and I get asked to compare Reagan and Bush. Both of them are tremendous individuals, and one of the things that I like so much about both of them is what you saw was what they really were and are. They're very compassionate people. President Reagan was somebody who had a very strong core beliefs, and he did delegate a lot, and because he had those core beliefs, those of us who worked for him knew what he wanted us to achieve. He really ran on the notion that you should lower spending, lower taxes, cut regulation, build a strong defense. And so it sounds simple, but it wasn't, and yet the guidance was so clear that it really allowed you to take on large responsibility and know that you were doing what he wanted done. George Herbert Walker Bush, as vice president and as president, I was around him when he was vice president all the time. He had this passion for problem solving. So he would throw himself into the task of resolving differences among or between groups. He liked to kind of get in every day early, get the intelligence briefing every morning. He and I would do that together at about 7:30 in the morning with one of the briefers from the Central Intelligence Agency. They've now turned this into a television show, which is not quite what we experienced, but the fact is, it is one of the most interesting 30 minutes you can spend where you get a picture of what's happening around the world from the best intelligence agency in the world. And then I'd brief him on his day, and the day would begin. And 12, 14 hours later, we would wrap up. He worked very hard. He loved exercise. He would run a lot. And he's, it's true what you hear. He maintained this unbelievable network of relationships and friends, wrote thousands and thousands of notes and letters. It was a great pleasure and privilege to work for him, to get to know the family, which I did. And I've stayed connected with him. We don't see each other as much as we used to, but it's a tremendous family. Clearly, it looks like we have another of the family members entering the fray, which is a pretty remarkable thing in our history. I often reflect now that the quality of the interaction with leaders like Reagan and Bush has just changed so dramatically in Washington, and that's unfortunate, and I don't think it serves us well in terms of the directions that we've gone. And that's not a partisan comment, it's true of both parties.
Let me follow up and tell you that in an interview we had with Caspar Weinberger before his death at the Pentagon, he said, and I quote, "This man is nobody's fool. He will not be put on a shelf." Did you ever hear anything like that during your time?
And he's referring to Bush?
Bush.
To Bush. I think that people underestimated George Bush as vice president, because George Bush as vice president did something that I honestly never understood how somebody so bright and so engaged can do, and that is he took a big step back. He came to terms with the fact, he sought the presidency in 1980, and Ronald Reagan was nominated and then selected George Bush as his vice president. He came to terms with what it meant to do that role properly, and proper was a word that he thought a lot about. And he knew that it meant that for him, somebody who had been active in the party, somebody who had been active in the Washington social scene, somebody who knew heads of state around the world on a first-name basis, that for him, he had to take a step back and be there to support the president. And it really is extraordinary. We debated, it's hard to believe this, but just to put this in perspective, we debated in the 1988 campaign cycle when it would occur that George Bush would separate himself a little bit from the Reagan administration. The campaign staff said it had to happen early in 1988. Early in 1988.
Really?
The biggest threat for a vice president who served for 8 years, one of the biggest threats is whether the public will accept somebody for 4 more years after already having been there.
Is he his own man?
Is he his own man? George Bush said it will not happen until the convention. And we said, the convention? Wow. He said, that's it, until I am the nominee, I'm the vice president. And even if it costs me politically, I am not going to kind of find my own voice, if you will, until then. Now, we kind of encouraged him that he had to think a little differently about that, and some opportunities came along to separate himself from some of the thinking in the administration, but actually it occurred, and it occurred around an issue with Manuel Noriega, but it occurred only when he kind of squared it, if you will, with Ronald Reagan, and the two of them agreed that they would do it. And the two of them, by the way, they met every day, every week, every Thursday for lunch. And if you think about the implications of that, these two individuals who were politically, running against each other in 1980, as soon as the presidency started, they wanted to do this once a week. And those discussions, I would sometimes be asked to provide background information for what the vice president wanted to discuss. He never told me what he chose to discuss. He never told me what was decided. And I was smart enough never to talk about it. But that was the nature, that was another thing that George Bush was incredibly good at, and that's discretion and keeping.
Did he create the phrase voodoo economics? And did he have to walk that back?
That's true. He definitely had to walk back from that a little bit, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he overshoot the target? Because some people thought, people like me on the outside, I was in Massachusetts and we had a guy named Dukakis running against him,
right.
Willie Horton and everything. We thought, watching, he was overshooting the target. He tried to separate himself too much from the president, almost to the point where at the convention, the president had trouble saying his name. And some people thought that hurt him because he didn't have the Reagan mystique to carry him.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I don't think, I know what you're saying, and of course, you were in a close proximity to that New Hampshire primary state.
That's right.
That was for us in 1988 make or break. We had campaigned, I always used to say, I've seen every level of corn growing in Iowa that there is. And we, hours and hours, days and days and days of campaigning in Iowa, we came in third. We had a number of people calling for the heads. There were 6 of us who ran the campaign, calling for our heads, because how could it be that a sitting vice president would come in third in Iowa? I could explain that, but that would take too much time and not to the point. But New Hampshire became make or break. And New Hampshire, they had to get to know him. They had to understand who he was. And I think no one's ever asked this question, but I actually think it's a very interesting one, because sitting there in proximity to New Hampshire with the media covering Massachusetts and New Hampshire together, we took on Dole. We were very tough on Bob Dole, who was the major challenger there. And ironically, rather than wrap our arms around Ronald Reagan, we wrapped our arms around Barry Goldwater, who agreed to come from Arizona for a last-minute weekend campaign stop. And there was something, I know for many of you, Barry Goldwater seems like really, really ancient history, but he was kind of ancient history then in some ways. But students would line up to see him. He was revered. And whatever it did directly for George Bush, it absolutely froze the media. All the attention went to what Bush and Goldwater were doing. And he ended up winning New Hampshire and moving on to win. But it's a very interesting point you make, because I think it is the case that early on, that's where some of this separation occurred.
It's funny because you mentioned about Goldwater. Students gravitated to Goldwater like they did to McCarthy in the 60s, except it was polar opposites. Yes. Before I get to aviation, did you ever think you'd step out and run for office from your own state or for anything?
You're good. I get asked these questions. I get asked lots of questions. I don't get asked this very much. It happened only once. I like operational stuff. So I like running things. And so I'm probably more drawn to administration work, executive branch work, than legislative work. But a very close friend of mine is Pete Wilson. And Pete Wilson was governor of California when there was a Senate seat that came open. And a number of my friends said, I hope you still have a residence in California. Now, the truth is, Pete is a good friend. I never asked him whether he had would ever even have considered it. But there was this moment in time when I thought, well, if I did have a residence there, you wouldn't have to run for office, except I quickly realized that I would then have to run for office in 2 years for the unexpired term and 2 more years for the new, it just wasn't that appealing. I feel, in some ways, I have a sense, like I said, that I'm probably better suited to executive branch activity. But I will tell you that we are in desperate need of people who brought wider life experience to these elected offices than what we're getting, and people who go there to actually try to solve some of these problems. And so I hope that we can encourage people at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, other places, at some point in their life, if they get that feeling, to step into it, because it's a tremendous opportunity. I will always be grateful for the time I had in government. I never intended to stay even 8 years, but it's a tremendous opportunity. It is a challenge, a big challenge and a big commitment to run for office, get reelected.
What brings you into upper management at AOPA? For our radio audience and those assembled who may not know the Craig Fuller story that eventually ends at the Fuller Company, what gets you to that presidency?
So this is another story I haven't really told. I was president of a small consulting firm after leaving the administration. After leaving government in 1989, and we were being acquired, in the process of being acquired, which meant that it was complete focus on that. And I've been a member of AOPA since 1973. I got my license in 1967. And in the middle of this transaction, I get my AOPA magazine, and it says that Mr. Baker is retiring, and Mr. Boyer, Phil Boyer, is taking his place. And I'm going, well, that would have been an incredible job. Boy, I wish I'd been paying more, paying closer attention. Went on about life. 18 years later, I get a call that Phil Boyer is thinking of retiring from a search firm, and would I come and talk to them? And I said yes. I'd run another healthcare-related association. I've been flying I had a Bonanza. I was flying all the time, and well known, among friends as a pilot. And so, the search firm actually found me kind of early in the process because it was 2007, and Phil Boyer had said he would stay until the end of 2008 to hit the 18-year mark. And so the search firm kind of didn't know what to do. I said, because usually a search lasts 3, maybe 4 months, and they find somebody. This was like 18 months. So I said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm very interested in the job. Got to know some of the board members, and one of these jobs it's very important for there to be alignment between the person coming in and serving in the capacity as chief executive and the board. So the time was used to try to kind of have a number of dialogues. The search firm said, well, you kind of check all the boxes of things that you've done in life, and the board agreed. So I got announced in June of 2008, and Phil and I had a nice transition period, and I started in 2009. I didn't have to move. I lived in Northern Virginia. I stayed there. AOPA is a wonderful organization, and the chairman and I had talked about this being a 5-year commitment. So I knew and he knew that that's kind of what I'd signed up for. We didn't really talk much about it. I wasn't really looking for another job, but I really felt there had to be a transition from somebody who'd been a great leader in Phil Boyer for 18 years to do some things that were new, and it was a terrific experience. I think we worked very hard to build a very strong public affairs or political presence in Washington and in the States. I think general aviation, from a political standpoint, is stronger than it's ever been. We started the General Aviation Caucus. We helped members of Congress start this. This is a device that members of Congress who are kind of like-minded or share a common interest form a, quote, caucus. And so you get them on all kinds of issues and all kinds of things, but there'd never been one for general aviation. And one of the members said to me early on, we had launched the GA Serves America campaign, and he said, we want to be supportive of that. We're thinking of forming a caucus. Would you help us? I said, sure. We thought if we got 30 or 40 people, that'd be great. Well, we got 60 and 70, and then we thought, gee, that maybe we get 100. Today they have 252 members of the General Aviation Caucus, which is more than half of the House of Representatives, which means you have the magic 50, more than 50%. It doesn't guarantee they're always going to vote, but in the same way, but the network of relationships is extraordinary, and that was a strong focus of mine. And the other was really working collaboratively with all the general aviation groups. We all knew we would be stronger if we couldn't be divided. And so we spent a lot of time on that. And Mark Baker has come in, and Mark's become a great friend. We talked over the weekend. In fact, talked last night about some things. It's been for me personally, it's been a very nice transition. I'm very fond of the people that I got to know there, and it's like Embry-Riddle. There's nice people who've graduated, matriculated from that organization to other places that I see fairly often.
Craig, now that the budgets are out, do you see hurdles for business and general aviation, now that these budgets are out, that they may have to go through?
There's been a long-standing debate, and it's going to continue. And it does threaten those of us in the general aviation community, because we believe, in the GA community, that we contribute a great deal to the economy. We contribute, the airports, general aviation airports, a network of 5,000 airports across the country. This is like, a national asset of enormous proportion, allows goods and services to flow throughout the country, allows businesses to set up in regions of the country they might otherwise not be able to serve because they can bring aircraft in and out. But the debate is around, how do we pay for some of these aviation services that the government is offering, whether we use them all or not? And this debate's occurring with a dramatic budget shortfall. And I think that all you have to do is look at our roads and highways or other things to realize that there's a trend towards getting the user of a service to pay for that service. And I think in aviation that we're going to see that. We're the only really, I think, developed country anyway, that actually raises the money to pay for aviation services, or the FAA, through the structure we use, which is fuel taxes, passenger fees, and taxes. Most countries today are tacking on a charge for the distance flown, weight of the aircraft. And that can go by many names, but if you call it a user fee, we've traditionally in general aviation been opposed to user fees. But I think the debate's going to be down the road, what's the proper structure? Now in Canada, they've actually exempted piston aircraft from this navigation fee, if you will, and there's a flat rate charged, and that helps the piston aircraft people. The business aircraft, though, do pay a weight and distance fee.
So if it comes up, would you be opposed to it if user fees come up?
Well, I have a new role in life. I've hung around long enough that I'm now an advisor to any untold number of groups. But my new role, at the request of the FAA administrator, as I was preparing to leave AOPA, is to serve on the Management Advisory Council of the FAA. Congress set this up in 1996 to operate kind of like a board of directors, but we don't have the authority that a private company board of directors or public company board of directors would have. We're advisory. But it's 13 people, all different backgrounds, but all backgrounds in aviation. And we've been trying to determine whether there's a better structure of governance, a better way to, if you will, run the FAA than today. So imagine that a recruiter calls you today and says, we've got this agency, would like you to consider being the chief executive officer. And this agency employs 47,000 people. It has 65,000 facilities. It controls, over the course of a day, about 50,000, some days 60,000 flights. It has several unions. It's a big management challenge. Oh, by the way, you're the chief executive officer, but you report to the secretary of the Department of Transportation, who's a cabinet officer. You're not a cabinet officer, but you report to one. Oh, but you also report to another cabinet officer, the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Oh, and then we have in the White House the economic policy people. They want to weigh in. The national security people, they want to weigh in. And then, of course, up on Capitol Hill, there are several committees, 435 members of Congress and 100 senators, none of whom want to see any of these facilities removed from their states or their districts. So would you be interested in this management challenge? Amazing we find anybody who is interested in this management challenge.
Wow.
So the question being asked in the testimony tomorrow is actually on alternative approaches to running the air traffic organization and the FAA. And so in the context of the question you ask, if I was convinced that we'd found a better way to run the FAA with a governing board of stakeholders, of people familiar with aviation, I actually think that question should be put to a group like that who looks at all the trade-offs. And if that happens, there are some who would say, and there are some who will be upset when they hear me say this, but there are some who will say that the fuel tax, which was created in 1936, it might be time to review whether that's as good a methodology as we think it is for collecting revenue. Now, it's true that it gets, quote, paid at the pump, except that actually isn't true. it gets paid by at a distributor, and then there's all kinds of costs associated with collecting it. The technology today in Canada, if a commercial jet or private jet is flying in the Canadian system, it's essentially like having your credit card on EasyPass. Whatever the charge is going to be, $100, $50, commercial flight, $1,200, it comes out of your account. Questionable airlines sometimes have to deposit money in advance or they can't file their flight plan. But the automation, there's not a lot of bookkeeping involved. It's all automated, and it's once you're in positive controlled airspace, the ticker starts and you pay accordingly. So I could argue that that aviation is absolutely a national asset, and it stimulates the economy, and the role of government should be to facilitate it, not charge us for it. But I do feel that the trend is moving towards trying to recover those costs. For the most part, by the way, we do recover the cost. FAA is about a $15 billion agency. All but $3 billion comes from the fees and charges, and that pays for really most of the operation. So we're almost there, where users are paying into the system to cover the cost of the FAA.
Is there some sort of debate or discussion now on the depreciation methodology to slow it down? Or
yeah, there has been, and that I think that's something where I give a lot of credit to the National Business Aviation Association, NBAA, and the manufacturers, General Aviation Manufacturers Association. I think it's been recognized that these are really assets for companies, and they in the interest of encouraging companies to acquire an aircraft or a fleet of aircraft, they've accelerated depreciation. By the way, sometimes you say this and people are thinking, oh yeah, well, the big rich business jet guys, but my Beechcraft Baron is a business aircraft. People are using Cirrus, single engine piston aircraft, as a business aircraft. They are useful for traveling and getting around, especially when you're traveling to places that aren't served with great frequency by commercial carriers. I remind members of Congress all the time that there are 5,000 public use airports. The airline serves between 400 and 500, depending on whether they're adding or cutting back their locations. So all those airports are being utilized by the general aviation community, and some for pleasure and personal reasons, but lots and lots of it for business.
Craig, it seems that the administration seems to always want to spar with general aviation. But general aviation puts a lot into the general economy. A Price Waterhouse study showed $219 billion. At the most recent meeting of GAMA, they had an annual press conference. My understanding, you were there for that. And while it didn't blow everybody's socks off, can you comment on that report that was given in February in Washington? I understand there were some high points within that report. Anything strike you?
Well, I think what struck me and what has constantly been important is the contribution to the economy, to jobs, to job creation. We're the leading exporter of American products, the aviation community is, in terms of balance of trade and other things. There are so many good, positive things that come out of this community. By the way, I don't need to tell this group at Embry-Riddle, but they're high-tech jobs, they're technology jobs. It's something that America has maintained a global leadership role in since the beginning, since the Wright brothers, and it's not a given that we'll continue there. There's a lot of challenges to maintaining that global leadership position, not just aircraft, but also our air traffic control systems, avionics, and other things. So I think that the message that came across loud and clear is we are a big contributor, and trying to get that recognized. When this is not a partisan comment, but when President Obama came to office, one of the things that remarkably he did was signal an interest to impose a $9 billion a year user fee on aviation. And the one thing I'll never understand is he said, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to put it in this year's budget, my 2009 budget, I'm going to put it in the 2010 budget. And it gave us a whole year, essentially, to go after this. But it was an amazing sort of lack of understanding about what the contribution was. And it actually, in some ways, he did us a favor because it accelerated what was already happening, which was we were already collaborating more, but it accelerated that. We launched GA Serves America, raised $4 million, got Harrison Ford involved, to say there's a value to general aviation. You ought not to tax it, as somebody used to say, you know, the more you tax it, the less of it you'll have. But we launched this campaign, and when it came time for the budget, there was no user fee. It just disappeared. And so like I said, I think early on, I think general aviation politically is in a very strong position. And I really hope, as I said, my role's changed somewhat, but I really hope as an active general aviation participant, who works with the leaders of the community all the time, that we'll take this opportunity and help drive the discussion so that we get an outcome that stimulates and doesn't, in some ways, debilitate general aviation through the burden of fees and taxes.
A reminder to our audience, we're going to come for your questions in the next couple of moments. So we're thinking of what you want to ask Craig. That'll happen in just moments. We'll have microphones assembled for you. Reauthorization at the FAA, I've got to come back to that. Every time that this comes up, going back to the Carter administration, there's talk about privatization for the FAA. You're not under oath, but I got to ask you, would that be a good thing?
Well, so let me try to define some of the terms. This debate has been going on literally for decades. When the FAA was initially created, it was independent. It was operated as an independent agency. President Johnson actually put it in the Department of Transportation. And that set up this even ever more complicated decision-making structure. And it's kind of a unique as a department because it's operating such a big, has such big operational responsibilities. In other developed countries, in fact, in almost all other developed countries, the air traffic control operation is run by an entity other than the regulator. So they've separated. So in Canada, you have regulation occurring within a government entity, and you have NAV Canada, which is a not-for-profit private entity that runs air traffic control. That comes with certain advantages. First of all, the board is made up of stakeholders, people with expertise in aviation. Secondly, they can go into the capital markets and they can borrow money, raise money for the things like NextGen, for modernizing the air traffic control facilities. They actually are inventing and developing technologies that they're selling to other countries in air traffic control. So they operate a much more private way. And North America, the U.S. has had this fascination with what happens to the north of NAV Canada. I went to NAV Canada 3 or 4 years, four years ago probably, and I was very impressed. But here's what you confront from our side. Canada is about 10% of the air traffic we have. The certification and regulatory work that the FAA does is many, many times over what anybody else does, and the rest of the world actually depends upon the certification work we do on Boeing aircraft and all the Gulfstream and Cessna and everything else. So it's a very different role. And also, right now we're in the middle of modernizing, with NextGen, the whole air traffic control system. It can be fairly argued that it's taken longer and cost more than people thought it would to begin with. And you can spend a lot of time, having that discussion if you wish. What we've tried to do on the Management Advisory Council, and personally what I like to do, is say, okay, well, we are where we are. What's the best path forward? And the problem that the members of the MAC have seen, and certainly the problem that I feel, if you were to just privatize our air traffic operation, you would pull out of the FAA the controllers and all these functions, but you would leave behind the regulatory piece. And actually, in this country, they have a lot of synergistic, important things that go on in one building at 800 Independence Avenue, FAA headquarters, with the safety staff, with the flight standards staff, with the air traffic organization staff, with the NextGen staff. And the one thing that the proponents of a privatized system who look at Canada or the UK or Australia or New Zealand, the one thing that they forget to mention, but is absolutely fact, is that for every one of those, there was a lengthy transition. There was a formal transition of usually 18 to 24 months. Formal meaning, you know, we start today and in 24 months, the transition's ended and we've separated these two entities. But functionally, it takes years. And our air traffic controllers who have really looked at this tell us in Canada it took almost 10 years. So our concern is that with all the work we're doing on NextGen, with all the work we're doing with UAVs, with all the things that are coming together, that ripping just ATO out would be a problem, which is why we got to the federal corporation, which keeps everything together, but creates a separate board to govern it.
About 3 or 4 years ago, the university sent me to Virginia to learn about NextGen. Then they had a series of forums here on NextGen, which has some incredible things that are going to move forward, to move aviation forward. But one sidebar on this, some have expressed concern that haven't followed the issue closely, and maybe you can tell us, that there are those in general aviation who fear that full implementation of the major core of NextGen as it affects them could bankrupt them.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Sure. You know, one of the things that, in fact, I'll tell you a story. I'll answer it by telling you a story. Senator Rockefeller from West Virginia was the chairman of the Senate Senate Commerce Committee, Commerce and Transportation. And he's a Democrat, but I've known him a long time. He came to a fundraising lunch and about 30 people, and he ended up sitting right across from me. And he said, well, before we get started, he said, you can probably tell me what this ADSB thing is all about. What is this ADSB? Now, this is a senator who's committee has been working on this for a long time. He said, my chief of staff didn't know. I asked her, she didn't know. So I said, well, I can answer the question, but I need about 2 minutes. And it all starts back in the mid-1980s. He goes, Craig, come on. I mean, we don't have that much time. I said, no. Ronald Reagan, recognizing the value of the GPS satellite system built for the military, over the objections in part of Cap Weinberger and the DOD, opened this up for commercial use. When he did that, 2 guys, one named Min and one named Gary, worked, I'm not quite sure the manufacturer, but it was one of the major manufacturers, who were building all kinds of navigational things for aircraft with VORs. They said, this changes everything. This is how people are going to navigate. They're going to use GPS. And the company said, no. We've invested in all this technology. They're not going to use this satellite thing. These 2 guys in 1989 were so convinced they were right, Min and Gary, they went off and formed a company. Gary and Min, Garmin. So that's 89. About 1991, many of us were carrying handheld Garmin units into our cockpits. And the reason this story is important is that general aviation actually embraced first the use of satellite technology for navigation. And what became clear was that the aircraft, through the use of GPS and the pilot in the aircraft, had more precise knowledge about where that aircraft is than the controllers did with a system that is decades old, World War II vintage stuff. And so ADSB comes along as by the way, it was put into Alaska in the 1990s and worked incredibly well because they didn't have a lot of ways to track aircraft. What it does is takes what the aircraft knows about where it is through GPS and sends a signal to a receiver on the ground over to the air traffic controller. Well, it has taken us, we tested it in the 90s in Alaska, worked incredibly well. I know people who were in Washington who were so impressed with this that moved to Alaska because that's where the action was. They knew that it was going to get bogged down in Washington. So when you hear the debate, I'm getting to your question, when you hear the debate about ADSB as though it's some kind of technology that's very experimental, it's been around a long time. We know what it is. Embry-Riddle, Aeronautics University has it in their aircraft. They've been using it successfully. So many pilots, though, heard that, well, the equipment and the installation could be $15,000 or $20,000. Initially, that's true. Now, it was also subsidized in some cases. So I give Mark Baker a lot of credit. We have been working to drive the cost down, and Mark Baker took this cause on, and over the course of a year, went to see the manufacturers, got pretty tough with FAA and said, hey, we're not going to make the 2020 deadline to equip if this equipment is costing $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 to buy and install. And so in last week, they had a nice article in AOPA that they've got a device now below $2,000. One of the things that's happened in the meantime, in the last few years, of course, is the iPad. So now some of this information can be placed on your iPad. The FAA has actually come around to realizing, hey, this is not a bad thing. So I think as we approach 2020, the cost will come down, making equipage less expensive. The challenge is going to be that I heard one estimate the other day that we've got to actually do about 30,000 installations a year between now and 2020 if we're going to make it, and that's a question. I actually went and said, okay, I want to see what this is all about. I've got the Baron in for an annual, why don't we do the ADS-B thing? And they said, well, good luck. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we kind of know what we're going to have, what the box is going to be that's required, but there's no agreement between the FAA, Beechcraft, and Garmin on your G1000 and the Baron. There's nothing certified, and this is one of the great problems in Washington. This is we go down a track to reach a goal, but some people go this fast, and then other people aren't moving at all, and so that's one of the challenges. But the cost, we always thought that there would be a reduction in cost, and the cost is coming down. The thing that the FAA and others have tried to convince us of is that equip with ADS-B out, so you're sending your information out that's fine. It doesn't really do anything if you're in the cockpit, but you're really going to enjoy ADS-B in because it has traffic information, weather information. We're going, well, we have traffic information and weather information now. So but the ADS-B in is not required in 2020, just ADS-B out. And I suspect what will happen is that there will be waivers granted and there'll be some delays, but if you're going to fly in highly populated areas, the FAA really seems to be sticking to this 2020 requirement. You're going to need some upgrade of your avionics.
We're going to get two questions here, and then we're going to come right to the audience. Let me draw your attention to a project that's going on now in Greensboro, North Carolina. You have two of the best engineering companies in the world. Honda on the airframe, General Electric on the engine. And they are teaming up, two of the best engineering companies with the best balance sheets, yet they can't seem to bring a simple light jet to market. Why is that?
Well, now you're going to get clearly outside of my area of expertise. The good news is Embry-Riddle has one of its best graduates there, in Andrew Broom. So he's trying to market them perhaps more than design them, but that's probably good for all of us if you know Andrew. But I think first of all, I've got myself type rated on the CJ3, so I have some basis of comparison, but I was always infatuated with what Honda Jet was doing. And I think you have to recognize that they simply think about these kinds of projects differently than we do in the US. This is a long-term passion and commitment to take what they know and get into aviation. They're going to work it and work it and work it until they get it right. And they're trying some new design concepts and ideas that are taking longer, but in this country, our companies have to live with this quarterly result sort of thing, and it's what's the return on the investment? There's just a whole different, I think, attitude there, and I think they're going to produce for certain kinds of missions an incredibly fine aircraft from what I can see, but But I think they'll take their time to get it right.
I want to ask my two colleagues, Kyle and Charles, if they can bring microphones up. Right at the end, if you'll come up, you can ask your question directly on record for Craig Fuller. But before we do that, one more area I have, and that I wanted to get this before we went to the questions, because I thought we would assemble them, have them stand so that we get them on, because we want to make sure we get them on video as well. The most recent federal aviation regulations, the Part 23 rewrite, you and your counterparts looked at this as a big victory. Yet the manufacturers are saying apparently just the opposite. In fact, the bureaucracy, from what I've been told, has actually gotten worse, and in fact, it's taking longer to bring things to market. They had agreed to rewrite, I think, Part 23.
Right.
What happened?
Well, I don't know that, Mark, I don't know that I know. You ought to get Pete Bunce in here from Gamma sometime. The manufacturers, the general aviation manufacturers, sure, have made this a high priority. I mean, an initiative that they really do think makes sense. It's all designed to try to drive out costs that are not warranted. And I think what the manufacturers really came to recognize is that, and now tried to convince the FAA about, is that they were simply over-designing and over-regulating some of the aircraft that to the point where you get priced out of existence. I give Gamma a lot of credit. They've kept the heat on. They've kept the community together in this. You know, one of the things we did with the Management Advisory Council is we interviewed 27 different groups on the things that concerned them about the FAA, and the whole area of certification and regulation was across the board the biggest concern, because you have the leadership recognizes it must change. Administrator Huerta and the leadership recognizes it must change, but it's a huge cultural change and a huge cultural shift in this regulatory area. You know, I don't know if there's anybody here from a FSDO, but FSDOs across the country are all very different. That's the way it's been and the way it operates, and I'm sure there's reason for that, and yet, you know, when I fly in Florida, I don't have different regulations than when I fly in Virginia, and yet two different FSDOs may look at the exact same product in very different ways, and they're trying to find ways to just be much more efficient in the way things get done and get certified. But it is one of the most troubling areas, and I think where Part 23 rewrite got caught up was in that process.
We're going to take questions now from the audience. Thank you for being with us. You're first tonight with Craig Fuller.
First, thank you, Mr. Fuller, for coming to Embry-Riddle this evening. We really appreciate what you've done for general aviation, what you continue to do. My question for you, sir, what do you see about the future of the third-class medical?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question.
The Pilot's Bill of Rights.
And this is, this actually is a good case study and a reason for some of the changes that we're talking about, because the FAA really has come to agree with AOPA and EAA, where we launched this together a few years ago, to try to get them to look at a proposal about which there was clear evidence that you could model it after Sport Pilot, and you could allow people to fly without risk to themselves or others in aircraft of certain power, daytime VFR. We argued that I remember when I was an advocate, when I was on the AOPA side, I remember saying to Michael Huerta, don't say no to this. This is one of these cases where we need to find a way to get to yes. If yes isn't blanket for everybody, let's have yes for 1,000 pilots to see whether it works, because we were so confident that it would not put people at risk, but it would keep some people flying. And Administrator Huerta, to his credit, saw the value of this. He had a staff recommendation to reject it, and he stopped that from going forward. And it did sit for a while, but eventually it went forward. And now, for some reason, it turns out the FAA administrator has to get the Department of Transportation to sign off on this, and then the Office of Management and Budget has to sign off on it. This is not where the expertise lies. The expertise lies at the FAA. And it's just taken an unseemly amount of time. Nobody would run an organization like this if you had a choice. So I think its time will come. Mark Baker has done a superb job in keeping the heat on. I'm going to reference it tomorrow at my testimony as one of the reasons why we need to look so hard at certification and regulation. This is an example of something that should have happened that hasn't happened. I do think it will afford probably tens of thousands of people with an opportunity to continue to fly and fly safely. I don't have many regrets. I would really regretted that we couldn't figure out a way to get it done. Jack Pelton and I teamed up, and we had a pretty forceful meeting at the FAA headquarters. Like I said, we were running against the tide initially, but they came to the right place, and I think it'll get done.
Right in the front, sir. Good evening, and thank you for being with us. Go ahead, sir.
I'm very impressed with what you've talked about as far as the operation of the aircraft in the air. I'm concerned a little bit, and maybe you can answer, what's happening to the composition in the structure where they're using wood and so forth to make molds, 1- and 2-piece fuselages. Do you have any knowledge about that, please?
Well, you'll quickly reach the limit of my knowledge, but I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. I early on, I'd heard a lot about the Cirrus aircraft, but I hadn't spent a lot of time with them. I went up to their manufacturing facility, and you see these molds sitting on the floor, people lifting up the left side, the right side, putting them together, and you go, really? But I admire the innovation and the technology that has gone into that. And I kind of scratched my head. I learned to fly a long, long time ago, and I thought a parachute. But inevitably, the parachute it's proven to save lives. We actually gave away, when I was at AOPA, we had the sweepstakes plane. We gave away a Cirrus, and you can't have much better of a day than when you give somebody an airplane. So. We always would come up with some stunt of some kind. So we fly into this little town in the Sierra Nevadas in California, and we've convinced this guy who's the winner that we have a television crew that wants to interview him because he flies. He's a pilot, but I think his nickname was Sky King or something. Anyway, we concocted something. So we show up in the Cirrus, and we go through this thing, and when he realizes he's won, he almost collapses in my arms, but he's so excited, and his wife is excited, and as we're walking around the plane, his wife screams. She just shrieks, and she says, "Honey, I can fly with you. It has a parachute." And I thought to myself, the probability. Oh, by the way, this is really also a good story. This guy flies for FedEx in Europe, and he flies an Airbus. And we had a cameraman from Sacramento, the television station there, filming him, and he's sitting in the cockpit, and the cameraman says, "Is it going to take you, time to move, learn how to fly this airplane versus your Airbus aircraft?" No criticism of Airbus intended. He said, "Well, it is going to take me a little time because this cockpit is a lot more sophisticated than what's in my Airbus." But the point of all this is that these innovators have done some remarkable things. I was also at the Beechcraft facility one time, and I watched them making the Premier jet, or the Beach jet, I guess now, rotating with carbon fiber, and they said that the FAA required them to do a test to prove that the fuselage would hold together under huge amounts of pressure. And I guess that one of the problems was they'd blow the windows out. I mean, they put it under, the fuselage is just, you cannot break it apart. But it's, so I'm not quite sure I know that, I want to make, you tell me if I'm not responding to your question, but it's different. I went to the factory floor in 1979 with my father and saw I bought a Cessna Cutlass, and and watched them manufacture 172s in Kansas. And yeah, so it's a lot different. And yet I think what you're seeing is innovation that's important, and it's important to the general aviation community. It's important we maintain the leadership. So far from what I've seen, structurally, these are very, very sound and solid aircraft that people are acquiring.
Right over here.
Good evening. I've got a Cessna 180, and for me to put an autopilot in my airplane, certified autopilot, it cost me about $12,000. Yet aircraft from P-51s down to the smallest experimental can put in autopilots for 1/3 the cost.
Right.
That's only one example. The entire experimental aircraft area has all kinds of safety devices that people with me with a spam can airplane, I can't put it in. And
It is a classic example of why we need to really, really look differently at this certification and regulation problem. I'm aware of that problem. Experimental aircraft pilots have used angle of attack indicators for years. Some of them absolutely believe, I've talked to them, that saved their lives, and yet you couldn't get a reasonably priced certified angle of attack indicator into a certified airplane. We had a session with the FAA at Oshkosh, now it's probably 3 years ago, and it was with the safety group, and we were pretty tough on them, and it really hit me at the time with the messages coming on some of these very points was that, typically in government, and if you move slowly, it's safer. It might be safer for your career because, the status quo is the status quo. If you're going to make a change, by definition, you're taking a risk if you're in the bureaucracy. What we said to them is, look at the consequences of some of your actions where you have delayed certification. There was a delay on the certification of terrain warning associated with your GPS. The FAA would not certify that for a number of years because they couldn't be convinced that it was nearly fail-safe. Well, the failure to certify actually cost lives. And that's what we said to them. Your mindset is wrong, and the technology is moving so fast that, just because you have people that have a question doesn't necessarily mean that people are safer because you don't act. So you don't put an autopilot in an aircraft. And now you get a pilot, not you, sir, but a pilot who becomes overtaxed in bad weather, where the autopilot is there to help, support the mission, but there's no autopilot because we're not going to put a $12,000 autopilot in a $40,000 airplane. So we have pushed the FAA on it. It's an entirely valid point. And I tell you the other thing that I came away with related to the so-called experimental or home-built aircraft. Are there any home builders here? Home-built aircraft people? Thank you, sir. There are more home-built aircraft, that go out for manufacture every year and get completed every year than there are commercially, built piston aircraft sold in the U.S. Van's aircraft, I think, sends out about 500, 600 kits a year. They finish about that many airplanes. When I was out there visiting with them, you had airline pilots, you had others who that's the aircraft they wanted. And that's talking about new composites and new manufacturing approaches. These experimental aircraft are very exciting, and they're very. I was impressed at Van's and others. They're very committed to training, which is hugely important to reduce incidents that they've experienced in the past. But that kind of innovation, I think, is important. But what we need to do is get faster at taking things that we see working in that environment and getting it into the certified world at a reasonable cost.
I want to get this into the program before I come to Kyle for his question. Drones back in the news because Amazon was back in the news last week. Tell our audience, at what point is the ultimate face-off going to happen between general aviation and those who want to put drones up?
Well, this is an extremely timely and an important question. This is another case, actually, where the failure to keep pace with the growing technology has put the FAA behind the curve. Although they are working faster and through approvals, they're getting more experience at this. But I think you mentioned Amazon in terms of their delivery mechanism. Amazon, the company, is selling, I'm told, like 15,000 of these a month.
That's correct.
Now I'm not sure what the total market is going to be for this, but these are going to be out there. I've had people say to me, "Well, but they're not that large." Well, I pointed out one of the training messages that stuck with me on my citation CJ3 training was the CJ3 is a spectacular airplane. I love it in many, many ways. One of the features is that in the forward storage area there's a lock, and you lock it with a key. What they showed us was the result of crews that they don't want to forget to lock it, so they leave the key in the lock, but then they forget both the key and the lock. And so the key sits there. They taxi out, they take off, and usually about climb-out time, there's been just enough vibration that key slips out of that lock and goes straight back, and it just happens that the trajectory takes it right into the engine. And usually knocks out the engine or requires a shutdown of the engine. A key. So if a key will do that, imagine what one of these 5-pound, 3-pound, 12-pound devices will do. And I hope it doesn't happen but too many times history of regulation is there's a crisis, there's a bad incident, and then we do more about it. So I hope there isn't an incident. I think we're all concerned about this. There's a dramatic video, if any of you watch AOPA Live this week. Last week they had the video of one of these small drones flying over top of a news helicopter, photographed by the other helicopter. The clever thing was the news helicopters followed the guy who flew it, who got in his car, drove home, and they followed him, so the police went to investigate. But we're putting these things in the hands of people who don't really appreciate what the consequences can be. So that's one problem. That's one big problem. Now, actually, I've been impressed by the largest manufacturers are looking at ways where their software can control both altitude and space, flying in proximity to airports. And that's pretty impressive. And I think they're doing it because they know if there's an incident, then there'll be a crackdown. The other development, and this is putting on my chairmanship of Redbird flight simulations, the other thing that we're seeing is that these are incredible devices. There's somebody that came in to see us that has a business that would fly a drone with the drone and its package of electronic devices that looks at the blades of wind turbines. That device costs like $50,000. Well, you don't exactly want to teach people to fly it by trial and error, and you're up close to a big metal object, But it's so useful, and that now they're thinking more about the training and how to really use it. So it's also clearly, to me, I've been out at Creech Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas and watched our incredible men and women who are flying missions in these unmanned vehicles. Their aircraft is in Afghanistan, and they're flying it out of Las Vegas. But they're passionate about aviation. They're involved in aviation. So in some ways, it's bringing people into aviation, and that's a good thing. But we need to find the right way to make sure that we're safe in the airspace. There's no such thing as see and avoid. With many of these, they're too small. So you have to have a sense and avoid capability. I'm sure there's research being done here on that. That's terribly important. And the more we look at sense and avoid, we're electronically now. I know there's something out there 5 miles away, 4 miles away, 3 miles away, I can divert, climb, or whatever. that's where we're going to have to go with this, I think.
Kyle, your question.
You kind of just touched on the question that I had, but what I've done some research on is UAVs with the use of ADS-B using radar. So do you feel that once we finally have the push in 2020, where there's not going to be so much non-cooperative traffic, which is, I feel, the biggest problem is the non-cooperative traffic, like you're talking about with the see and avoid, where even the smallest, like some of these even micro UAVs, you can get a little tiny radar on it for less than $100 that'll actually do ADS-B out and in. Just changing the radar signal around. Do you think that finally that's really the reason the FAA has been pushing back so hard, is that they're just waiting for that final ADS-B push in 2020?
So let me take that in two parts. And I don't mean to be. I actually just think I'm not sure there was a strategy for the delay. I just think the delay was due in part to the inertia of a bureaucracy trying to get a handle on this. I wish there was a good explanation like you offered, but I'm not sure that's the truth. I do think, though, that this is a case where, and it may help lower the cost of ADS-B across the board, because I am aware of these lower cost devices. I do think that there's going to be a real push, especially, my guess is it comes initially for the commercially used UAVs that are larger by definition, and they're being flown for business, that they're going to have to equip with something, an ADS-B type device that gives us the ability to sense and avoid them. There's also, I was being told the other day that they can build the sense and avoid into the UAV. So the UAV sense with ADS-B in, I guess, senses an aircraft and it turns off, which, again, for the commercial use, I think is going to be, probably a part of the requirement. But the regulation, the problem with the challenge with the regulation is it does not happen fast, so it's going to be a couple-year process. Good question. Glad you're working on it, though.
We've got precious minutes left. A couple of questions we can take. Here's Jerry.
Hi. Yeah, I've been a member of the AOPA for probably about 25 years, about the same amount of time I've been a member of the NRA. And a while back, I got on the AOPA's website and saw there was a blog there, a little conversation that they were having. They were just giddy over flying down to Cuba. And so I sent a email to them and I said, are you going to make any efforts to warn the pilots that Castro has actually shot down general aviation airplanes? Are you going to do that, warn the pilots, or are you going to have the FAA do that? And basically the reply I got was, well, we don't want to get involved in the politics of this. So my question to you is, why can't the AOPA be more like the NRA? Okay.
You're suggesting I should mount guns on the Baron? I don't know. Well, so you're going to be surprised with my answer. I've been to Cuba 3 times. I'm among those who said, if a policy doesn't work for 50 years, maybe you should think of changing the policy. Not because I'm in any way a sympathizer of Fidel Castro. He treated a lot of people horribly. They also did some good things, but he treated a lot of people horribly. And it's been a very repressive regime. But the 3 trips I've made have really impressed me with the Cuban people and their desire to interact with Americans. And it's at all ages. This could be a whole session on this, so I'll make this short. One meeting involved, we took down the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the State Department said, well, we don't really like it that you're doing this, but we know you guys. If you're going to do it, you're going to do it. But you're going to sit and you're going to talk to dissidents. Before you leave, you're going to talk to dissidents. So they organized about 12 dissidents. These people were ages, 20 to 60. Many of them had spent a majority of their life in Castro's prisons. And they each told their story, and they were all terrible stories. So when they got through, I said, okay, this has been very moving. This is the kind of thing we feared. We're going to go back and we're going to talk about our visit here. What's the one thing we could do in the United States that you think would improve your life and the life of your family? And every single one of them, to the horror of the State Department staff, said, end the embargo. Open up this relationship. And so you have to draw a distinction between the Cuban government and the Castro regime with the people of Cuba. The people of Cuba are warm and friendly and gracious, and they meet you at the harbor and at the port and at the airports. And they will welcome American tourists. So I hear what you're saying. I'm not in any way prepared to say that the Cuban government is rid of people who would wish Americans harm. But I think that era is behind us. And I'm from California, grew up in California. Everybody knows about California. California is about 700 miles long. It has a coastline, that goes up to Oregon through San Francisco, Monterey, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, San Diego. Just think of that coastline and what's on it. Cuba is as long as the state of California, but it's an island. So it has this beachfront on both sides. It has an infrastructure of airports and ports that, if the Soviet Union did a lot of bad things, but they built an infrastructure. So I've met with the AOPA folks. I don't know when the first trip to Cuba is going to be. I know there will be trips. And I guess I would look at it as an adventure or a part of this transformation in the relationship between these two countries. Because once we start going there, and once Americans get a sense of what's in Cuba and the Cuban people, and the Cuban people get the chance to engage with us, it won't go back. And even the government officials I met obviously couldn't hold their positions unless they were loyal to Fidel Castro and his brother Raul Castro. But they all talked about, they'd been educated all over the world. They changed a lot of their financial system over the years so they could do business with Europe and the Canadians and everybody else. So this evolution has been ongoing. We've just kind of stepped back and said, we don't want to be part of it because we don't like the government. And I understand that, but I actually think there'll be more change as a result of the approach. This is one in which I agree with President Obama.
Exit question.
Yeah.
Do I have one more? Okay, I'm going to give my question to you, and then we'll close out. Go right ahead.
Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now.
If we do away with the third-class medical, what is your opinion, how that's going to impact on the LSA group? In return, how is that going to impact the GA as a whole?
Sure. Lisa, it's a great question. I know it was troubling when EAA and AOPA advanced the third-class medical, because I think that in some ways I think the light sport aircraft community is a fabulous community. The products are wonderful. They're right for lots and lots of people. I think there was an expectation that was perhaps beyond what was realistic in terms of them becoming training aircraft and being used in all the ways they thought they would be. I think some people, probably with the third-class medical, will find that a new light sport aircraft is what they want and what they're comfortable flying. So my view is what we need to do is keep people flying. If we keep people flying, we keep a market out there for a wide range of aircraft. And I really don't think it should be detrimental to them, because I think those who thought that this was going to be the aircraft that all people would flock to who couldn't get a medical, that's probably not right. And some people honestly don't want to make that transition from an aircraft they're comfortable with and used to and could fly without the third-class medical if this provision goes through.
I want to thank a couple of people who helped make this. First, Bob Score for getting this on video tonight, to Kyle and Charles, who helped assemble the people that would ask the questions. Dr. Phil Kincaid back at our radio studio. Lucino, thank you so much for your coaching, because you helped make this a very successful program. And our host for tonight, Dr. John P. Johnson, the president here at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. If we have the slide, I want to show them what's coming up. Our final offering for the spring, and it will be on April the 13th. Not there. So I'll just picture this. General Charles C. Baldwin will be with us. The president of Embry-Riddle every year does something called the Veterans Appreciation Day Ceremony. And that happens on the 14th, and it's Dr. Johnson's offering to veterans. And he does it aside from Veterans Day to make it a very special day. We invite veterans to come. The ceremony begins at 11, but the night before, General Baldwin will talk about the role of religion in the military. Very controversial. Are people allowed to express their faith? How does it conflict with other thoughts that are out there? General Baldwin was a chaplain in the Air Force. He will talk about what it was like to be a chaplain, why he came to serve, and what the role is for a chaplain today in the controversy of religion in today's military. That's our final offering for the spring. We're off for the summer, and when we come back, Aviation once again opens our season on September 3rd, when we will talk about Tuskegee pilots, and then George Will joins us on September 15th. So we have a very exciting season coming up. Our conclusion, and you're all invited, on April 13th to hear General Charles C. Baldwin right here in the Captain Willie Miller Building, the Gail Lemron Auditorium. Once again, a warm welcome and thanks to our guest, Craig Fuller.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being with us. Have a very safe ride home.